Welcome to our series on solving checkmate puzzles. So today I'll be focusing on how one could solve longer checkmates and mating nets in general. The traditional advice to learning how to do longer checkmates has always been practice, which means go and do as many problems as possible and eventually you'll get a hang of it. But what I'm going to be doing today is to deconstruct that hang of it. What's the intuition behind longer checkmates? That's the focus of this problem. If this is interesting to you, please hang on and let's get started. Okay, let's start with a simple puzzle. Simple in that it is just 3 pieces on the chessboard, but definitely it's not simple in its solution, especially if you haven't solved problems of this nature. So in order to solve this problem, and this is very specifically a checkmate in 2 moves, the things that you need to do is always observe, understand, and calculate. And in order to calculate, you need the intuition behind calculation, which is developed by this ability that every one of us as humans have, which is to be able to find similarities between different things and differences between similar things. The degree of this ability may vary, but each one of us has been endowed and blessed with this particular ability. This is the core of problem solving. So let's see how this actually manifests in this particular problem. So let's start with observe. What do you see on the board? You can make a list of a couple of things. You can pause the video here and just say, okay, these are the things that I observe, and then you can double check with what I have to say. Did you see the following? The black king is on the edge of the board, which means very high chance of checkmate. Not many escape squares for the black king. He's kind of surrounded. And the checkmating piece is going to be the rook with the support of the king. Right? So the king is going to be the controller and the rook is going to be the one who's going to be the attacker. So if you've observed all of this, what do you do next? You understand what needs to be done here. The first thing you should be able to understand here is that checkmate in 1 is not possible. The only 2 possible checks here are rook to f8 and rook to g7, either of which is not a checkmate. Which means the sequence of checkmate here is going to be white will have to make a move first, black will respond to that, and white will have to checkmate right after that. So the big $1 million question here is, what is that magical first move? So let's have a look at it. So in order to calculate, first let's make a list of all the squares. What do you see? I mean, you see a bunch of red squares. What is this? What are these red squares? And the answer is this is the potential squares to which a white piece can move. Okay, there's quite a few. I mean, the rook can move to 14 different ones and the king can move to 3 different unique ones. 2 of them overlap. So if these are all similar, because they're in the same bucket, that these are all the squares a white piece can potentially move in the first move before throwing the ball back into black's court, they look super similar, but are there differences? So let's start looking into the differences. So I have differentiated all of those squares that I marked earlier in 3 different colors now. There's the red squares, there's the blue squares, and the green squares. What are the red squares? How are they different from the blue squares? And how are they different from the green squares? This is based on the dimension of which piece can make the move. That's your clue. You can pause the video, think about it for a second, and see if you can find the difference between the 3 categories of the boxes that I've made. And the answer, if you were able to crack this, would be all the red squares are the one where only the rook can move. The green squares are the one where only the king can move. And the blue squares are the one where both rook and king can move. This is your first understanding of the problem, which is a little deeper than just your basic observation. Now let's try and look at it in a different way. Now I've categorized the red squares into 2 different ones. The red squares remain and then there are black squares. What is the difference between the red squares and the black squares here? What is the dimension here? You can pause the video, think about it, see if you can figure out what is the difference between these 2 categories. And the difference is the result. The black squares are the places where you don't want to move your pieces because it leads to a losing move. And a specific note here about f5. f5 is a black square where you don't want the king to move. The rook can still move there, but not the king, because if the king moves to f5, the rook becomes an apple with no support. The black king can capture the rook. And the rook going to f8 is really bad because, again, it's an apple with no support, kind of doing a desperado move, and the black king can capture the rook. So if the king were to move to any of the black squares, or the rook were to move to the black square on f8, then it basically means that the rook is swaha, and the game turns into a draw. Whereas all the red squares are still the ones where it's not going to be a losing move. And the red square on f6 is particularly of interest because that's the square where either king or rook can move and still the game would continue. This is my second dimension. The dimension number 1 was based on which piece is going to move to a square. Dimension number 2 is whether it's going to be a winning or a losing move. Now that you have this insight, what do? You eliminate the black ones. You just focus on what's remaining. You make your life a little easier. You apply dimension 1 and dimension 2, and you have all the red squares. They all look very, very similar, but can we apply the same skill once more? Can we further find differences between all these similar red squares? The answer is yes. So I've divided them into blue squares and red squares. What do you think is this differentiating factor between the blue and the red squares? And the answer is zugzwang moves. Zugzwang moves are basically forced moves. Moves that you force your opponent to do one and only one thing. The problem with all the blue squares is that the black king gets an option to move either to h8 or f8. But if the rook were to move to any of the red squares, then basically there is no other option. The king is forced to go to only one square. Like if for example, if the rook moves to h7, then the black king is forced to go to f8. And if the rook moves to, say, f1, then the king is forced to move to h8. So this is my third dimension, which is the zugzwang move. Now, can I further differentiate? I've removed all the blue squares, focus only on the red squares, and I've further differentiated them by marking one of them in orange. The reason why this is differentiated here is because of the final result. If the rook were to move to any of the red squares, then the king is forced to go to king h1. Whereas if he moves the rook to h7, then the king is forced to move to f8. So the response of where the king goes to, and possibly the result based on that, because if the king were to move to f8, you don't have a checkmate. But the king moves to h1, you have a checkmate in one move, which is a back rank mate when rook moves to f8, which is the answer to the question. But we need to be thorough. Let's be meticulous. Let's go back and revisit all the blue squares and see, can I find the end result here? Can the final result come in here? The answer is no, because it's not going to follow the pattern that we observed, which is white makes the first move, black responds, and white checkmates. So let's take an example. If the rook were to come to g7 and give a check, even if the king goes to h1, you don't have a checkmate in one move. So having applied all these three dimensions, you can then be able to come to the answer that essentially the rook has to move to any of these red squares, doesn't matter where. He can move to f1, f2, f3, f4, f5, f6. And all of this will force the king to go to h1, and then rook can move to f8, and that would be the checkmate. So this is how you would try and do any kind of a multi-move checkmate, a mating net. You think about the response the black has and think about making it a forcing one, a zugzwang move. Essentially, the move that white makes is what I call it the zugzwang move, which is forcing the opponent to go or to move only to one particular square. So what are the next steps of leveraging these patterns and these calculation skills? I always say learn chess as it makes you really good at cognitive calculation. Think of dimensions of your move. There are multiple dimensions to every move. I just showed you a couple in the preceding few minutes. Follow this channel for more insightful videos on checkmate patterns, calculation, and pattern recognition skills. And if you love the video, please share your comments, subscribe, click on the bell icon, and don't hesitate to share the video with your friends and family. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next video.